Welcome to the Dire Gentleman channel, folks. I'm your host, Guso Milcarella, and I'm joined today by this gigantic freaking axe that I'm gonna be grinding for the next runtime of video. If you're new here, how you doing? I'm a professional writer, which means when I go out and buy a can of Chef Boyardee and cheap instant ramen, the money I used to pay for it came from my writing. But I'm not the only professional around here, and the script for this video was typed by Ruthie Hanson, writer of several books and scripts, which, in her own words, are hella gay. So go check them out. Links in the description. Unlike war, media criticism changes. It changes over time. And so too does the environment which it cultivates. Put simply, the way we consume movies, television, and comic books today looks pretty different from what it did 5 or 10 years ago. These days, I wouldn't say that media literacy is at an all-time low, but it's certainly not at an all-time high. Case in point, this. That's right, ladies, germs, and non-binary worms, we're talking about villain protagonists. And if you know me, or have seen a few of my videos, you know that I'm not a big fan of this term. Because, and let's get this straight here, this term is not and should not be a thing. It is a horrible chimera of two contradictory concepts, like cat dog.
Cat dog, alone in the world was a little cat dog.
And yet, everyone and their grandma has been spitting it out like watermelon seeds. And I don't know about you, but I'm getting pretty tired of getting covered in goddamn watermelon seeds. So, in this video, we're going to be talking about the term villain protagonist, what it's supposed to mean, and the types of characters it's meant to reference. Now, before y'all get tap happy on those keyboards, I want to preemptively address 2 points that I know someone is going to bring up. Number 1, villain protagonist is just a label people like using. This is just semantics. And number 2, why does it even matter? First of all, I know it's a matter of semantics, but I'm a writer, and this is YouTube. This is a bare-knuckle boxing pit built for semantic discussion, and I intend to discombobulate. As for why it matters, the short answer is understanding what labels you're supposed to use for these types of characters, understanding how and why they work, will, just in a practical sense, make you a better writer. See, everyone thinks that writing is just putting words on a page, but it's so much more than that. And if you want your work to end up in more places than just a dusty old desktop folder, you need to be able to do what's called a pitch. You have to boil down what you've spent your life working on into a single sentence. Let me give you some examples. A farm boy gets swept up in a planet-spanning rebellion to save the galaxy. An alien with fantastic powers falls to Earth and grows up to be its savior. Anyway, the discipline to be able to sum up what you've got in your head in ways that are short and understandable is a necessary skill to have. Oftentimes in the industry, ideas will live and die on the strength of their pitches, and being able to classify your characters in language that is understood by grass touchers will do nothing but help you in this department. Villain protagonist is a shining example of a contradictory non-term, which at best will confuse the people you want to sell your story to, and at worst will damage your ability to explain your work in basic terms. Ergo, if you want to get paid for writing words, you should know what the words mean. So get cozy, grab a snack, grab a controller, play a video game, or draw something in the background, whatever, tab over, doesn't matter. We're here now. This is the video. We're gonna talk about villain protagonists. Part 1, TV tropes. TV tropes. The Devil's Stomping Grounds. TV Tropes is a website founded back in 2004 by a guy named Fast Eddie. And in the almost 20 years, I'm old, that it's been running, it has been the touchstone for self-important data entry types to demystify all art by meticulously reducing it down to crude building blocks. And considering that this lightless abyss and the communities that spawned from it are the only ones that actually treat the term villain protagonist with legitimacy, I have absolutely no qualms putting some blame on this monstrosity of ancient internet culture. From this primordial source, usage of villain protagonist has spread far and wide among the usual suspects. Amateur Twitter writers, TikTok fetuses, and the worst, most vile breed of all, YouTubers. I'm bullshit. Kill me. Something about this term has really latched on to the collective unconscious, and as we'll get into, utility is most likely not the reason. Could it just be a side effect of the human instinct to categorize and subcategorize? Or is there something more sinister going on here? The way to begin parsing villain protagonist is to define that first word. According to Webster, a villain is defined as number 1, a character in a story or play who opposes the hero, number 2, a deliberate scoundrel or criminal, or number 3, one blamed for a particular evil or difficulty. Now, definition number 1 is, put simply, an antagonist. Someone or something that stands in the way of our Wuzza Wuzza hero Buzza Booza quest.
No, you made that up.
So, by that merit alone, any coherent usage of villain protagonist can't be based on that first definition. The other two definitions are a bit meatier, but in contrast to the first, these do not specify a context within fiction. One might use the second definition of villain to describe a deliberate scoundrel or criminal, but in a more colloquial sense. The advantage of this more flexible definition is that it can be applied to both fictional characters and real people, but the biggest limitation is the inclusion of the word deliberate. Without a lenient reading, this definition would disinclude most individuals who unintentionally cause harm and whose deliberate actions are well-meaning. There are deeper moral implications if we dig into the nature of scoundrels and criminals, but I think we should be more constructive and move on to that third definition. A villain is one blamed for a particular evil or difficulty. I think that this is the way most people use the term, even if they don't intend to. Villain, simply put, is a word we use for othering people. Think of the classic Disney villain. Think of what it is that people love about them. These are characters who are fun, colorful, boisterous, and entertaining. They stand out from other characters in the story, and ultimately, we are meant to see them as responsible for evil. There is always a possibility that we relate to these characters, but the intent to differentiate them from the baseline morality of the audience takes precedence. Now think of some of the modern Disney villains in comparison. It's easy to see that their emotional reality and moral frameworks are quite a bit more down to earth. Aladdin had Jafar, a preening narcissist who wanted to effectively rule his society and marry the heroine against her will. Encanto had a sad grandma who was working through some stuff. Beauty and the Beast had Gaston, a preening narcissist who wanted to effectively rule his society and marry the heroine against her will. Moana had a sad volcano lady who was working through some stuff. I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong with the way these newer antagonists are written. They are suited for the types of stories that these new movies want to tell, regardless of if Disney sticks the landing. More to the point, these are still antagonists, but almost nobody calls them hero antagonists. Again, outside of TV tropes. For all the difference they have from classic Disney villains, they still oppose the protagonist in the story and are understood through that lens. The addition of sympathetic traits does not make a character a hero, if structurally that's not the role they fulfill, and the inverse is true for villain protagonists. Giving your protagonists moral or ethical gray areas, dubious methods, or even a twisted worldview can be an engaging experience for both creator and audience, and can be a conversation starter to confront the more difficult truths about the society we live in. But here's the thing, a well-written immoral protagonist will still invite the audience to empathize in some way or another with their point of view, and that is a position that a proper villain will never be able to occupy for reasons both literary and practical. We can all agree that Be Prepared is a banger, but I don't think anyone here is going to try and say that Scar had the rightful claim to the throne, or is doing a good job ruling the Pride Lands.
Well, this sucks.
But that invitation to connect with a complex protagonist can be used to surprise and chill you, fulfill a power fantasy, or even stand as a warning against immoral behavior. Light Yagami, Walter White, Frank Castle, Harley Quinn, Holden Caulfield, Wario, Humbert, Rick Sanchez, Tyler Durden, Don Draper, Loki, V for Vendetta, Robin Hood, Jack Sparrow, Kratos, the Mandos, Anakin Skywalker, and fucking Joel from The Last of Us are all complex protagonists with varying degrees of lawfulness, morality, and ethics. They run the gamut from being morally right but ethically dubious to but all of them are placed in the role of protagonist instead of the villain role because it serves the narrative. The reasons that a writer might do this vary, but it's worth going into for everyone looking to write their own less than squeaky clean protagonist. There are a lot of different ways to write complex and satisfying characters without needing to sugarcoat whatever messages you have to share. Although I'm sure I'm going to get yelled at in the comments for excluding something, I would like to offer up 3 subcategories for a morally dubious protagonist: the anti-hero, the wish fulfillment character, and the cautionary figure. Many of the characters I just listed fall into one or more of these subcategories, and sometimes characters can hit all three. But no matter how simple or complex, the point of these disruptive or moral characters is to start a conversation. So, hi. Let's talk about meth. Part 2. The Anti-Hero. I know, in this year of our Lord whatever, some knob on the internet is still talking about Walter White. But when you want a prime example of an anti-hero, you can't really go wrong. When we begin Walter's journey, he's a mild-mannered kind of pushover, helpless, and honestly, just a little bit of a loser. And then he gets cancer. I think just about everyone who saw that pilot can back Walter 100% behind his decision to become the greatest meth cook this side of Mississippi. I'm sure some of you at home might have even seen parts of yourself in Walter's journey. His frustration with the American healthcare system, the disrespect of his peers and students, the helplessness and loneliness of dealing with something so big on its own is something I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. And from that on-ramp is a steady, masterfully crafted descent into absolute madness as he lies, cheats, steals, and cooks his way into the infamous title of Heisenberg. In retrospect, we can all agree that Walter White is not a hero. But he is our protagonist, and is readable throughout the whole story as such, despite where his character arc takes him. We start the show by rooting for Walter in hopes that he achieves his goals, but by the end, we're horrified that we ever sided with this psycho to begin with. Bryan Cranston's performance can never be understated. Jesus fucking Christ. But remember, he's not a villain, because villains are characters who are othered from us. They're obstacles who oppose our point of view character within the story. And in Breaking Bad, that point of view is Walter White's. The pilot centralizes Walter White as the most notable figure in the show, inviting us into his perspective. And through his slide into immorality, he evolves into the quintessential anti-hero. But not all anti-heroes put in as much effort to get us to root for them. Travis from Taxi Driver and Alex from A Clockwork Orange are both S-tier unsympathetic in this regard. Alex more so than Travis, I would argue. At least with Travis, you understand that his mental breakdown and subsequent murder spree comes from, post-war trauma, which makes a lot more sense than Joker disease brought on by vague economic anxiety. Arthur Fleck would have gotten into crypto. When you look at these kind of reprehensible characters, you tend to notice a pattern, that the anti-hero themselves becomes synonymous with the effect they have on the reality of the story. The more Walter becomes Heisenberg, the more the central question of the story goes from how far would you go to take care of your family to how far would you go to justify your worst instincts. Our empathy for his actions diminishes across the later seasons, but the absence of that element transforms Walter White into more than your average narrative figure. His greed and lust for power, which we once inadvertently cheered on, becomes the driving force behind the absolute destruction done to his friends and loved ones. Walter White's battle with cancer brought out his worst self, but metaphorically, Heisenberg is also a cancer, one that ravaged the world and left behind untold death. The conversation started by this anti-hero is one of accountability. Do we know a Walter White in our own lives? Is it us, ourselves? Are we the danger? Are we the one who knocks? Part 3. Wish fulfillment. Look, this one's pretty self-explanatory. If you've ever been a teenager on fanfiction.net, you're familiar with the wish fulfillment character. It can take many forms, but in the context of this video, we're talking about the morally dubious, ethically challenged voice of reason that has questionable motives, but goddamn is he the best cop the Force has ever seen. Usually, this is a character who is an asshole to just about anyone and everyone, but he says what everyone's thinking, or at least what the portions of the audience with similar proclivities are thinking. I think Rick from Rick and Morty is possibly the best example of this. We find an unexpected charisma and likability in a character who is an asshole, but also the smartest asshole in the room. It's not just projection, you guys. I really are smart, and not just a asshole. A wish fulfillment character is usually intellectually superior to their peers, or physically superior, or both. Comic books definitely corner the market on the super cool revenge assassin thing, as the whole baseline for superhero comics start with the concept of, what if a super powerful dude could fix things? And yeah, when you see V break into a corrupt senator's home to murk the jerk in the shower, we as the audience are not about to get our pearls in the twist. Now, in the last decade or so, there has been a new mutation to this character label in the form of the rewritten villain. Everyone points to Maleficent on this one, but I'd say it began with the true story of the Three Little Pigs by John, I'm so sorry, Sciascia? If you've never read it, it was a picture book in the late 80s told from the perspective of the big bad wolf from the Three Little Pigs fable. But unlike these later villain retellings, the true story takes a much more satirical approach, presenting a direct irony between the wolf trying to convince you that he had no choice but to eat the pigs who died of natural causes, and the actual horrifying nature of eating your neighbors. That kind of nuance is a far cry from Maleficent or Cruella, which just take a villain character and then make them a empathetic hero. And even though I love some Star Kid, Twisted's whole point is basically doing this.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
But within this space, sometimes you get something like Wicked, a book and later Broadway musical that smashed expectations, and is one of the most enjoyable big-budget spectacles since Cats. Oh, not that Cats. Jesus Christ. That's much better. Part of what makes a morally questionable wish fulfillment character work is that it acknowledges that the audience might have moral blind spots worth questioning. Eddie Brock in Venom 2018 is an offbeat journalist whose methods of revealing corruption aren't legal, and when he takes advantage of the woman he loves to get the scoop on the case, we see him as a morally gray figure. Contrast Venom, the alien parasite who he shares a body with, whose heroic traits are mostly eclipsed by the fact that he straight up eats people. Between the two of these rewritten villains, they're a lethal protector, able to do the right thing while also crossing the lines that social norms prevent most of us from doing. That is authentic wish fulfillment, because the character overcomes many of the barriers that stand in the way of outcomes we would ultimately want. Others might regard them as villainous, but in this story, those others are yet more antagonists standing in the wish fulfillment character's way. Part 4. Cautionary Tales. This is probably the closest we're going to get to what people define as villain protagonist. A character who is so morally reprehensible, so repugnant to a sensible person, that their journey is less about relating to them and more of a cautionary tale. And these types have been around for literal centuries. Oedipus from ancient Greece and Othello from Shakespeare being great examples of this type of protagonist. These are tragic figures, meant to potentially warn or guide the audience away from the protagonist's shitty decisions. There is some conceptual overlap with the anti-hero, but our repulsion to the character arc is usually more immediate, either preordained by prophecy or some existing form of knowledge the audience has. I know we like to make jokes about Joker on this channel, but Arthur Fleck is less a rewritten villain and more a genuine attempt at this kind of tragic figure. He has little to speak of as far as admirable goals or redeeming qualities, but we're not here to watch him succeed, we're here to watch him fail. Before Arthur, there was Travis from Taxi Driver, and before Travis, there was Humbert Humbert from Lolita. These are people we are not meant to like. Each of these tragic figures finds their lowest point through a negative character arc, usually pushed there by circumstances beyond their control. They are often misled by other characters or the environment around them. Walter White might have got what he deserved in the end, but Arthur Fleck never once got what he deserved, and that was what put him on the path to committing violence. And in that vein, let's talk about one of the best examples of this, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange is one of those films that will always be divisive. It was controversial when it came out, and it remains controversial to this day. If you've never seen it, it starts off in a dystopian England, in a world parallel to our own, where the streets are run by lawless youths who break just about every rule under the sun, not because they are morally compelled to help people or because the system has chewed them up and spit them out, but because they are young and no one is stopping them. And in one of these many street gangs, we find Alex, the leader of the Droogs, who's known for his hot temper and merciless conduct. Eventually, Alex gets arrested and is put into a government program to try and condition every hurtful urge from him through the use of chemical coercion. Basically, they give him a drug that makes him nauseous and played Nazi footage while they forced him to watch, which reprogrammed him to get physically ill every time he had an urge to hurt people. The twist in this scenario is that while they were conditioning Alex, they played Beethoven over the footage, which was Alex's favorite musician. The point of Alex's story is not to sympathize with our protagonist. Hell, we as the audience might even feel a bit of joy watching him get tortured by government officials. But that's not the point of the film. The point is about what it says about society. When Alex finally hits his breaking point, he ends up in the hospital after trying to swan dive into the pavement. This gets the media's attention, and now that the spotlight is on the government, the officials that once treated Alex with no humanity all begin to posture for the cameras, in a PR move that seems far more humanitarian than they really are. We are not meant to agree with Alex directly, but rather we are meant to criticize and draw parallels between this irresponsible dystopian government and the apathy from our own elected officials. That is the point of the film, and if you condense that down to, well, Alex is a villain protagonist, it robs it of a lot of its nuance and punch. Part 5. Who's a villain anyway? I want to go back for a bit to talk about that term villain. We've discussed already that villains are often more of a caricature than a fleshed out, fully realized person that we can connect to. But even if that's what it means, that's not always the case. From the dawn of time, villains were often coded to be gay, trans, all manner of queer, really. Everyone from Buffalo Bill to Ursula to Norman Bates has some level of queerness worked into who they are or how they act, which often has real-world implications towards already stigmatized and marginalized groups. It's no wonder then that kids who felt differently growing up might find themselves more aligned with the bad guy than the hero of the story. Which is how we get subverted stories where these villain tropes are applied to heroes, like Megamind and Despicable Me, and even Shrek. By being more introspective with characters that once fit that standard villain mold, storytellers can in some ways start to undo a lot of the damage caused by stereotyped caricatures of marginalized communities. Human beings need narratives, they crave stories, and sometimes this need will bleed over into real-world us versus them dichotomies. Because we like to pick sides, we like to feel as if we have a community. So when you grow up your entire life feeling and being told that you were different or wrong, you find a much easier time connecting to narrative figures who are being told the same thing. And when those kids grow up to be storytellers themselves, they pull from those experiences to give us richer and more interesting stories for the next generations to enjoy. I mean, shit, let's compare some of the iterations of Dracula. In the original Bram Stoker novel, Count Dracula was a one-dimensional predatory monster who fed off the blood of the living and preyed on young, innocent girls. Fast forward to the modern day, and Castlevania the series has given us a Dracula who is complex, tragic, loving, and vengeful. This natural evolution is a boon to narrative storytelling, because we are able to express ideas, grief, anger, and love in ways that we might not have been able to if Dracula was just the standard Dracula. It wouldn't have been the same punch, the same despair, if instead of walking into Alucard's childhood bedroom and being confronted with the betrayal of his family, we got this.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
But as much as modern Dracula is a notable and complex character, he is not the protagonist of Castlevania. His crusade against humanity is the obstacle that the heroes of the story must overcome, not only through raw might, but also by refuting it thematically. Castlevania is, at its heart, a story about conquering the death drive and embracing all that makes us feel alive. What Dracula brings to the table is the conviction that none of it is worth the struggle, and that all must die. But the people who come to oppose him and that ideology find hope of a brighter future, all because his position as villain made each of them question, why do I want to live? Now let's compare that to a character who is at a glance thematically similar to Dracula, but in his modern incarnation fulfills an entirely different role. I am speaking of Thanos, the Mad Titan. The protagonist, yes, just protagonist, of Avengers Infinity War. Much like Dracula, Thanos is motivated to commit mass genocide, and his convictions are just as inflexible. While his comic book counterpart is one of the most famous supervillains ever created, he is positioned as the pivotal character of Infinity War and is commonly referred to by fans as the film's protagonist. And in terms of narrative structure, that claim is fairly well supported by the text. Thanos is the one who goes through the core beats of the hero's journey, with his own adopted daughter Gamora acting as both goddess and temptress in the Campbellian sense. The feminine figure who initially leads him towards abandoning his quest, but through a trial of love grants Thanos the boon he needs to succeed. But these fairly literal nods to the monomyth and the intended centralization of Thanos come at a cost. By making Thanos the protagonist of Infinity War, he ceases to be a villain. His goals are still morally reprehensible to most sane people, but because of the way he is framed by the writers, it is difficult not to side with him on an emotional level. To explain what I mean, I need to ask a question. What is the theme of Infinity War? I'd say that the most important one is the concept of sacrifice. In Captain America's own words, the Avengers don't trade lives, but at several points throughout the movie, their failure to do so only worsens the situation. Loki gives up the Space Stone to save Thor. Doctor Strange gives up the Time Stone to save Iron Man. Scarlet Witch hesitates to destroy the Mind Stone because she wants to spare Vision. And the most frustrating example of all in the eyes of many Marvel fans, Star-Lord is unable to accept his role in Gamora's death, and this results in Thanos' imminent victory. Taking this all into account, Captain America's philosophy of "we don't trade lives" starts to seem hollow, facile, almost unrelatable. Cap is not behaving out of character, and we might even sympathize with his values, but in Infinity War, he is structurally a villain, an antagonist. He would doom the world for cheap sentiment, and this delusion ultimately leads to more death. This death does happen at the Infinity Gauntlet-wearing hand of Thanos, sure, but in the Mad Titan's point of view, a point of view shared by the cinematic language, this appeasement of the inevitable force of death is the better outcome. One perfect trade that will save the universe from itself, an opportunity won through several smaller trades leading up to it. There are a lot of logical inconsistencies in Thanos' actions, especially when analyzed within the full context of the MCU. But within the emotional and thematic landscape of Infinity War, his character arc interacts with the plot and structure in a way that makes him an ultimately moral being. We know that Dracula is wrong in Castlevania because of the lengths the heroes are willing to go to refute his deep-seated beliefs. And likewise, we know that Captain America and the rest of the Avengers are wrong because of the lengths Thanos goes to do the same thing. All that is to say, Thanos is not a villain protagonist. He is a protagonist who commits a mass murder that is morally justified as the greater good of the story that he's in. And because we, the audience, are invited to so completely empathize with his point of view, we end up loving and cheering him on for it. Now that's how you start a conversation. Oh yeah, and just real quick, I am speaking purely in an emotional, cinematic storytelling sense. I am by no means advocating for a randomized mass murder of half of the universe, and anybody who thought that I was in that previous section is having difficulty not projecting their morals onto fiction, and that's kind of how we got here in the first place, but I'm doing this to head off comments at the pass, but also to encourage you that if you got to this far in the video, just say, Dire Gentleman advocates the snap, and I will just assume that all of you are playing along with this bit. Now for the conclusion. Getting invested in deep characters is one of the most fun parts of fiction, but that depth sometimes means compromising our comfort and expectations. When we allow a sliding scale of morality in our narratives, it facilitates a conversation and broader look into the complexities of the human soul. The construction of effective, morally gray characters is a skill that is necessary for exploring the taboos and social stigmas in the world around us. Art reflects life, and there are many parts of life that are just not ideal. But by transforming those shortcomings into something palatable for others to share in, we are able to process things like trauma, social discontent, injustice, and derision. And we can find ourselves in morally dubious characters almost as a means of therapy. Not to get all Game of Thrones finale on you, but stories are what make us human, and there is no creature on this earth more complex. So why, after all of that, do I still despise the term villain protagonist? Well, fundamentally, it's because art needs to be more than labeling the tools we use to make it. Moreover, the dilution of those tools will inevitably lead to weaker outputs, which in turn leads to less impactful art. If you told me, or someone you respect, that you were writing a villain protagonist, what response are you hoping to get from your interlocutor? Do you want them to believe that you can handle dark subject matter, that your protagonist will be complex, or that your story will eschew conventional morality? Do you want your work to be compared to the likes of Breaking Bad, A Clockwork Orange, or Infinity War? If these are your intentions, your biggest obstacle in developing and pitching your work would in fact be the term villain protagonist itself. If you have a central character who is opposed by an antagonistic force and maybe carries a theme or two, that's your protagonist. It's as simple as that. As for the tone, morals, and unique voice of your writing, that all needs to come from you, not the TV trope's training wheels. Because that's exactly what terms like villain protagonist are. And until you eschew those crude training wheels, you may never never know the joy of creating something which you can truly call your own. All I'm trying to say with this public service announcement is that we should all think more deeply about the intricacies of the stories we create. There are so many angles through which fiction can reflect and critique our reality, and exploring those boundaries of our shared psyche should mean setting ourselves free from overly prescriptive expectations and moralities. But what do you think? Are there any immoral main character types you think we missed? Leave a comment down below and tell us. If you enjoyed this video, let us know by liking it, and make sure you subscribe to the Dire Gentleman channel twice. First by subscribing, and then by ringing the notification bell. Whether you're a villain or a protagonist, we'll be seeing you in the near future.